Hello, welcome to the Office Developer Training content for Microsoft Teams. This module is Tabs and Connectors. My name is Paul Schaeflein. I'm a Microsoft MVP in Office Development. This module will cover in depth the Tabs and Connectors capabilities on Microsoft Teams. To get an introductory session on Tabs and Connectors, please review other modules in this repository. For tabs, this module is going to dive deeper into static tabs, then review tab content and configuration, and follow up with a demo covering this. Static tabs are tabs that you can add to the Teams interface in a personal context or personal scope. At its core, a content page or a tab is a content page displayed within an iframe. The information that you choose to show inside this iframe is completely up to you. When the app is added, or when a Microsoft Teams app is added that contains a static tab, it will automatically provision those tabs in the UI, as you see in the screenshot here. You can access the tabs either from the app bar or from the bot personal one-on-one conversation. To add static tabs to a Microsoft Teams app, you update the manifest. There is a node named Static Tabs that contains the necessary information. Each tab must have a unique entity ID. This uniquely identifies your tab within your app. There is a name which is displayed to the user as part of the tab name, and then there is a content URL. The content URL is hosted within an iframe. In addition, you can include a website URL. On the tab user interface, there is a button for the user to open the tab in the browser. The website URL is the URL that is navigated to within the browser. A key thing to keep in mind is that you must have the tab URL must include it in the valid domains. Microsoft Teams will only show content from the list of valid domains, a whitelist, if you will. If the domain is not listed in the valid domains, the tab will not render. It's very important to make sure any domain that you call within the Microsoft Teams app is included in the valid domains. As you can see, this screenshot also includes a valid domain called token.botframework.com, because it's possible that an app may want to get information from the bot framework. Again, any URL that your code is going to be called within Microsoft Teams needs to be listed in the valid domain list. The other type of tab is called a configuration tab or a configurable tab. The configurable tab has two pages that you need to author. One is the tab configuration. The configuration page is displayed when a user adds a tab to a channel. Again, configurable tabs are only displayed inside a channel. On this configuration page, you collect any information required for your application. And when the user clicks the Save button, Microsoft Teams will call your set settings function in JavaScript, it will call the onSave event handler. Your job is to call set settings, passing to Microsoft Teams the URL to display the content URL to be displayed inside the tab. And in addition, you specify that entity ID, as we mentioned before, that uniquely identifies this tab within your app. Conversely, the tab content is what most users will see once the tab is configured. It's rendered in an iframe, just as we saw on the static tabs. Again, you specify the URL. However, the URL is not specified in the manifest. It is specified when the configuration page is saved. Within the tab, you would typically inspect the context of the tab for the entity ID or subentity ID and use the information from that, based on that entity ID and subentity ID, to pull data from wherever system to show the appropriate information. So let's walk through a demo on tabs. In this demo, we're going to demonstrate static tabs. What you see at the screen at the moment is the Apps tab of the team called Training Content. On the bottom right is the link to upload a custom app. However, I'm not going to do that in this demo. We've done this in previous demos and other modules. I'm going to open up if you notice on the left-hand side, there's the ellipsis, and here are what they call app bar, and there's a list of apps that are installed as well as go to store. The store obviously is linked in many different places within the application as well. I'm going to go to the store, and at the moment you'll see the Microsoft Teams App Store. But if on the left-hand side, if I scroll to the bottom, there's again an option to upload a custom app. Because I'm logged in with an account that is a tenant administrator, I get the option to upload for my tenant, or I can upload for me or my teams. I'm going to choose upload for me or my teams, and again pick the same Microsoft Teams app that I would typically use. And I get the installation experience in here. Now this app that we've included includes bots and messaging extensions as well as tabs, so it shows that I can add things for you or add to a team. Add for you are items that have a personal scope, and add to a team are things that have a team's scope. Because we're just focusing at the moment on static tabs, I'm going to turn off the add to a team capability and see I have the ability to add for you. A chat, keep track of important content and info in the tab, and then send rich content in a conversation. This first one is my one-on-one bot, the second one is my static tabs, and the third one is the messaging extension. So I'm going to install, and this app will then be loaded for Megan, who's the person logged in. And you can see the choices. These are the options that we installed. Which one do we want to see? And so I'm going to first I'm going to click on app, which is the personal app to view your content in one place. This is my tabs for this particular app. So you see here's a conversation, but now you'll notice in the tab strip we have a candidates tab. And clicking on that, you see a page. It says here's information. It figured out that I am logged in as Megan B, and that is the personalized information for Megan. Now if you notice, if I open the ellipsis here in my app bar, I see my Office Dev Talent bot, right? And that's the same view that we saw before. If I were to click on store a second time, right, it would show, if I scroll to the bottom, all the apps, they're all listed in here, right? So again, because I loaded for me or my apps, nothing changes in the store experience, but it's now installed in this conversation. Now, to show the configurable bit, which was built in a previous module as well, I'm going to navigate again to the team, right? And if I look here, I wanted to then manage the team, right? Again, it doesn't show up as the apps in here. As we saw before, I could do the upload down right here. Again, we can also do this upload bit from the store. So just to show that experience, we'll upload a custom app here. Again, we'll choose me or my teams. We'll choose this app. And now I'm going to turn off that and say I want to add it to the training content team and click install. And now I get an experience similar to what we saw before. Here's the information that's set up. You'll notice the first time experience is run because it's been added to a team, and it's showing all the information, right? Now, because our tab, we have a configurable tab, we have the ability to set up the tab right here. Right? This is a somewhat different experience than what we saw before where we manually added a tab. I'm going to click the setup button here, and you'll notice now behind the scenes it's navigated to my general channel in my training content team, and it has launched my configuration experience. In this configuration experience, we're asking what name should we display in the tab strip and which job posting are we looking for. So I'm going to put a name in here so that folks understand what this tab contains, and I'm doing the senior software engineer for hiring manager Julian. And if I click save, you'll notice now the tab is named Senior Software Engineer. The hiring manager is Julian. I have the same application. So you can see I have this information, right? I can still update the tab because I have the settings information to relaunch that experience. Now this one hasn't coded the pull the existing information, right? But that's something that you may want to do. But you can see the tab works in configure for individual tabs or for users, right? Now you'll notice the tab is listed here, is in here twice, once in the personal scope and once in the team scope, right? So maybe I may not necessarily want to do things the way that I did that, right? So you can see it can be somewhat confusing. So depending on your application, you need to understand, do I want to instruct users to install that personally using the store for me and my teams? Do we want them to install it in an individual team first that also has to have one-on-one information? That's a part of the deployment considerations that you should consider. This particular app probably works best by deploying it just to a team. Regardless, let's go now look and see at the code that's been running behind the scenes that supports all of this. I have opened my manifest.json file. So what you'll notice here is my static tabs. And so this is really just specifying a content URL and the website URL. I forgot to show you the website bit. My apologies. If I go to my one-on-one conversation tab, this link over here on the upper right goes to the website. Will open the browser with that URL. I've stopped my Visual Studio IIS Express, so that won't work at the moment, but that's where the website URL shows up. And again, you'll see personal scope. Then we have the configurable tabs, and the configurable tabs is just only has one URL, the config URL, and then it describes the scopes that are in which it is allowed to run. Now I want to look at the page. So if I go back to my static tabs, in the tabs folder I have my candidates.html, and here's my candidates.html file. Right? And you'll see a couple of noteworthy items in here. So number one, we're pulling in the Microsoft Teams JavaScript API. If you remember when I showed that page, it said hello Megan B. Right? So we understand who the current user is. Now, this particular sample page just uses some jQuery and JavaScript to do a little bit of dynamic updates. You're free to use any technology that can run within the browser. The Yeoman generator provided by the Office Dev team will generate React components for you. Okay, that's covered in the other module on the fundamentals of Microsoft Teams. When the document ready is when we initialize the call to the Microsoft Teams API. And so this is how we get the user's name, or the UPN in this example. So you cannot make calls to the Microsoft Teams API until you initialize, and you should initialize when the page is fully loaded. So you can see that's where we're calling here. And we're making a call to get context. And the context comes back. We want the UPN of the current user. And we're just then inserting that into a HTML element. The rest of the page is just plain HTML with CSS to screen. Notice it is all static data. Obviously, a real application would do some dynamic calls to data services. But the example here is to get you started with an option for what we might want to show. I'm not going to show the configuration. Again, this might be a little bit of a repeat from the previous module. But again, we have the Microsoft Teams JavaScript linked up in here. And then on document ready, we do a little bit more involved work. So we set up some variables that we might want to do to store information. Here's our call to initialize Microsoft Teams. And then we're going to wire up the save button. Right? And so, I'm sorry, we don't wire up the save button. We need to tell Teams when it's okay for the save button to be enabled. So in this example, we're using the text box for name to set the tab name. We can't have an empty tab name. And so we're wiring up a listener to say whenever the input box changes, I want you to do some comparison. And if the value that's entered is not equal to 0, then that's valid. Otherwise, it's false. And so when the page first loads, the box is empty. The validity state is set to false. The save button is disabled. As soon as you type a value into the text box, this code runs, sets the validity state to true. The save button is then enabled. Next, you'll see where we're setting a save handler. So when the user clicks the save button, Microsoft Teams will call this function. And in this function, we're passing the save event. We don't necessarily need what's in the save event parameter at all. But at this point, we're going to call and get the context. And now, what we're going to then, we need this, we want the context because some of the information that's provided by Teams we want to store in our backend system. So, what we're doing here is creating a URL. Remember, the onSave event or the onSave handler must set the content URL for the tab. And so we know it's going to be our channel tab.html, but we're going to be passing in some query string parameters. This is one approach for us to pass data in. Right? And so what we're going to be sending in is the team ID. So in my context, I have the team ID, and I have the channel ID, as well as the job posting, which is the value that they chose. If you remember, what the configuration page had a name and a Dropbox. So which one did they choose? So this is one approach for us to say, this is the job posting, or this is the item that this tab represents. I can just send that information through in the query string. I could, if I wanted, store this information in a database of my own choosing. It's your choice, depending on the amount of data and the sensitivity of that data that you'll want to decide where to store it. I have to send an entity ID, and the entity ID here is just concatenating a string with the team information. Again, this is something to make sure I have uniqueness. And then we call set settings. And in the set settings, we're going to set the entity ID, we're going to set the content URL, and we set what's called a suggested display name. Obviously, users can change that. Microsoft Teams allows for changing the tab name as well, but in this example here, and then we have our website URL. After we make this call to set settings, we tell Teams that we're done, success. The notify success will close the pop-up and then rendering. Again, the rest of the HTML is just static HTML. Again, you can get React components from the generator, or you can write any web technology that suits your needs. Now let's move on to connectors. We'll talk about connectors versus notification bots, why you may choose one or the other. We'll talk about the connector registration as well as the inline connector experience that has recently been developed. As we saw in the bots channel, there is a capability of sending proactive messages to notifying users and in putting the items in the alert feed, activity feed. This is called a notification-only bot. A connector works very similar to a notification-only bot, so you want to make sure you choose the right technology to deliver your business value. A connector is configured for a specific channel. So a team owner has to go to a channel and choose to add a connector, and they have to have a very specific connector experience. A notification-only bot, on the other hand, can be configured for an entire team, and it's added using the app experience, right? Notification bots work in personal scope and they can post to the activity feed, so there's a fundamental difference between the two. However, a notification-only bot requires you to actually create a bot and register a bot and do all the bot framework type things that are necessary to send messages to a channel and or to a person. A connector generates a webhook URL, and your application can then make a post to that webhook URL to send information. So the back-end onboarding experience for connectors is much simpler than building a bot. So they have similar capabilities and similar functions, so choose the one that is best for your scenario. Before a connector can be used, it must be registered with the Connectors Developer Dashboard. This is a site hosted by Microsoft in which you come in and you configure and register the application that you want to do for a connector. Right? You can see here a quick screenshot and a list of the information that you need to provide. You'll notice that all of them are required except for the valid domains, so this information must be filled out. In short, you're going to be describing the Connector Developer Dashboard is intended for publicly available connectors throughout the entire Teams ecosystem. You don't have to publish a connector to everyone in order to use it, but the Connector Developer Dashboard allows for that capability, thus requires you to enter the information about your company as well as your application. The key thing that you end up showing is the configuration page for your connector as well as the valid domains for which actions are supported. Our demonstration is not going to be doing actions. However, if you want to have actions work, you'd want to put your domain in there. In addition to that information, there is also after registering your connector in the dashboard, you get a registered connector section which has various links and buttons that you care about. The top one says "Build your connector" is a link to the Microsoft Teams JavaScript library. We've already included that in our project, so you most likely have that already in your Teams application, so you don't necessarily have to get that. There are some buttons for you to test your connector. Connectors work in Microsoft Outlook as well as in Teams, and so sideloading to Outlook lets you enable your mailbox to receive connector messages. The Teams testing is by downloading a manifest. This will generate a Teams app manifest with your connector information filled in. We're not going to do that in this demo because we know what the settings are. And in fact, typically if you're adding a connector to an existing Teams app, you already have a manifest and don't necessarily want that one. However, there may be value in downloading that manifest and copying the connectors node from it and pasting it into your app. The last button allows you to publish to the Microsoft Store. If you're building a connector that you want every user and every tenant to have, you would publish to the store and go through the store review process. If you're publishing a connector just for your internal application for your organization, there's no need to publish to the store. you can do the registration and then just leave it as unpublished. It is then available to people who have your app. So that if they've uploaded your app in some fashion, they can then see that as the uploaded apps, and we'll see that in the demonstration. New to Microsoft Teams is the inline connector experience, right? And so the connector experience is very similar to the tab configuration experience, and we'll see that in our demonstration. But when a user then configures a connector, they choose the connector that they want to configure, and Teams will load your configuration experience. It's a web page similar to the tab configuration. The user can enter any information that's necessary that you wish to store as part of that instance of the connector. In short, you're going to get a webhook URL, but perhaps there's some other authentication code or configuration experience required. Totally up to you, whatever you need. The user presses save, which triggers a callback in your code, and your code can then retrieve the webhook settings. And you should store that webhook URL in your backend system so you can post later. Let's go around to the demo and we'll show about adding a connector to a channel. In our demo here, you can see I have Chrome opened to Teams. I've logged in as my tenant administrator. I'm using Chrome in this example because I want to show some JavaScript code, and the Chrome Developer Tools experience allows me to see that. In this team, I have a channel named Talent Management Connector. In this Talent Management Connector, I'm going to click the ellipsis, and then you'll see here is the option for connectors. This is the Teams connector experience. And you'll see we have on the left-hand side a list of connectors that I have already configured. Those are in my account, and categories. This category looks similar to what we've seen in the Microsoft Teams apps store. Right? Again, these are the publicly registered connectors. And the right-hand side is a list of connectors that are available to me. There are sections here. There are connectors for my team, which are already configured. The forums is pre-configured. All the connectors in the store. And at the very end of this list will be a list of connectors that are part of side-loaded apps. I'm going to then configure this connector, and I get the inline connector experience. It's at this point that I'm going to open the developer tools to show what's happening here. And so I want to, at the moment you'll see we're just showing some introductory text with the webhook URL and a blank space and the save button. Right? So I'm going to go into my developer tools here, and we have a breakpoint set in our code here where we're getting the webhook URL. So now I'll click save, and you'll see I hit my debugger. And if I look through here, you'll see here the settings object that I get has a URL, right? And that webhook URL is something I need to store, right? This demo code is not storing it anywhere. I just want to show the ability here that, I can now get my webhook URL. The demo app is configured that it loads that webhook URL on first launch, and so when it first loads the page. So once the setup is done here, we can actually edit this experience and see that information again, right? So again, I've now configured my webhook, and so in this list here, you'll see now it's under the managed section, the configured. I already have it's already configured, and if I look at this ability here, I can click on manage. You'll see here we actually are getting it. And we'll just let this continue. And the webhook URL didn't show. That's my little bug there. But the webhook URL is from our settings. And so the idea, of course, here is that we can have these webhooks and send information to them. So let's look at the page that's building this webhook. In our demonstration, our lab app, there's under the connector folder, there's a connector config. And again, this is an HTML page with some jQuery. We have a link to the Microsoft Teams API. And here is our document ready where we do some similar code that we've already looked at before. We have the initialize method in which we're going to initialize the API. And then we're going to call to get settings. Microsoft.teams.settings.get settings will return to us a settings object. And in the settings object, it includes the webhook. And there is my typo right there. That should be in uppercase. And this it's just a sample code to show us what the webhook is, because obviously it's not going to be shown, but On first load, it's not there. And so in this particular example, on this register on save handler, we're going to set the settings. And what we're going to set this time is a content URL, which would be the content URL in this example is going to be our configuration experience. That's used by the manage experience. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here is because this is the context in which we're running is the connector configuration. When I just give it an entity ID, that's going to signal to Microsoft Teams that we have a new connector. And that's all we have here. After setting the settings with our entity ID and the configuration URL, we immediately want to call get settings a second time. So when we first load and we get settings, there is no webhook URL because the webhook is not configured until the user clicks save. Once the user clicks saves, we need to call set settings to set the information, and we can immediately call get settings, which will return our webhook URL. At this point, you should save this webhook URL in your backend system so that it's available for use by your system. Beware, once the notify success call, the dialog will close. So you don't want to call notify success until you've successfully persisted this webhook information. One other thing I want to point out here, I showed you the developer tools. It's possible in Microsoft Teams client application to also get the developer tools. So for example, I'm going to go through into a tab. So I'm going to just pick any tab that exists in my tenant here. I'm on a tab at the moment here. In Microsoft Teams, I've actually set this, you can set to be the developer preview. Right, so we're going to switch over to the developer preview. And when you're in the developer preview, you can then enable the developer tools within the Microsoft Teams experience. So again, I have a tab open, and then I'm going to open up, right-click on the tabs icon in my system tray, and because the developer preview is enabled, I can now open the dev tools right here. And in doing so, we'll then open a window with the developer tools once the browser loads here. In this module, we've covered static tabs, tab content and configuration, connector registration, and the connector inline experience. Thank you.